Billionaire spots two twin boys trying to sell their only toy to save their dying mother. He steps in to help, but what unfolds next will uncover his buried past, reopen an old wound, and change all of their lives forever. The late afternoon light slanted through the bare branches of maple trees, casting long shadows across the damp paths of Maplewood Central Park. A crisp breeze carried the earthy scent of wet leaves and distant chimney smoke. Near a rusted bench by the pond, two boys sat close, their identical frames hunched forward against the cold. "Maybe if we smile more," Eli said, his voice low but hopeful. Owen didn't answer. He was staring at the red toy car in his lap, running his thumb over the worn plastic hood. "It's not about smiling," he said. "They don't even look at us." Eli sighed and glanced around. A man in a business suit passed by, his phone pressed to his ear. A woman in gym clothes jogged past, earbuds in. No one slowed. No one noticed. They had tried 6 people already. No one stopped. "We just need one," Eli murmured. "One person to care." Owen nodded but said nothing. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a napkin-wrapped sandwich. They split it without talking, chewing slowly, watching the people who moved like ghosts around them. "Maybe we should go closer to the fountain," Eli said between bites. "More people." Owen looked at the toy car again. "You really think Mom would want us to do this?" "She didn't say not to," Eli replied. "And we need money. We've already skipped 2 doses." Owen closed his eyes for a moment. "Okay." They stood and brushed crumbs from their jeans, which were too thin for the season. Eli held the toy car now, red, faded, the front bumper slightly cracked. It had once made sounds, but the batteries had died years ago. Still, it gleamed in his hands like something sacred. Peter Caldwell stepped off the park's paved trail and onto the grass, loosening his tie with one hand. He was heading toward the pond, away from the crowd. The board meeting had gone as expected, numbers up, morale down. He needed air, even if it was sharp and cold. He was halfway to the bench when a small voice called out, "Excuse me, sir?" Peter turned. 2 boys stood on the path, identical in size and shape, but one's eyes were a touch softer, more hesitant. The other, the one holding something in his hands, stepped forward. "We're selling it," Eli said, extending the toy car like it was an offering. Peter blinked. "It's really fast," the boy added, "and the door's even open." Peter looked down at the car, then at the boy's face, tight with nerves, pale from the wind. His brother stood behind him, arms crossed but eyes searching. Something tightened in Peter's chest, a sensation he hadn't felt in years. He glanced around, expecting to see a parent nearby. There was no one. He crouched slightly to be level with them. "How much?" he asked, the words leaving his mouth before he could stop them. The boys exchanged a glance. "Whatever you can pay," Owen said, steady and serious. "We just need it for our mum. She's really sick." Peter didn't move. His gaze fell on the car, clearly old, but clean. Its surfaces showed the faint imprint of countless touches, small hands holding it over and over again. He could see a fingerprint smudged into the plastic windshield. He didn't know why, but he reached for his wallet. The wind picked up as he flipped it open, pulling out 3 bills, large ones. He didn't count them. "Here," he said, extending the money. Eli's eyes widened. His fingers trembled as he accepted the bills. "Thank you, sir," he whispered. "This will help our mum a lot." Owen gently placed the toy into Peter's open hand. His fingers lingered for a moment, as if reluctant to let go. Then they turned and walked quickly away, their heads bent together in quiet conversation. Peter stayed where he was, the car resting in his palm. Its weight was nothing, but it felt heavy somehow. He looked after the boys until they disappeared around a bend in the path, swallowed by the movement of strangers who still didn't see them. He should have turned back, gone home, made his evening calls. Instead, he stayed, still crouched, still holding the car. Wind stirred the trees behind him, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked. He closed his fingers around the toy and stood slowly. He didn't understand why, but something had cracked open. And it wasn't the toy. The sun was dipping below the buildings as Peter Caldwell crossed Maplewood Avenue, his polished shoes stepping cautiously along the cracked sidewalk. The sky had dulled to a heavy blue, the kind that settled early in this part of town. Across the street stood Maplewood Heights, a peeling brick complex with crooked mailboxes and a flickering porch light. Peter shouldn't have followed them. He knew that. He had appointments, a team waiting for updates, people he paid to care about what he thought. But the toy car was still in his hand, and something about the way those boys had walked away, fast, quiet, like they didn't want to give the world a chance to change its mind, had made it impossible to look away. At the bottom of the rust-stained stairs, an old man stepped out of the first-floor unit. He wore a cardigan with elbow patches and carried a plastic grocery bag that sagged with cat food. "Evening," Peter said, hesitating. The man squinted. "You look lost." "I'm not. Just wondering if you know a woman who lives in 3B, Grace Whitaker." The old man nodded, his face softening. "Grace. That sweet girl's got 2 boys, twins, good kids. Keep mostly to themselves." "She been sick?" "She's been barely moving. I saw the boys taking the trash out last week. One of them was crying, I think." "You a friend?" Peter looked up at the stairwell, then back down. "Something like that." He took the steps slowly, paint flaking under his fingers as he touched the railing. The air grew colder as he climbed. At the 3rd-floor landing, the hallway light flickered above his head. He heard voices from down the hall, a television murmuring, a baby crying behind a closed door. And then, at the far end, one door stood ajar. He stepped closer and heard whispers. "She's still hot," Owen said, barely audible. "Give her more water." "I did. It's not helping." Eli's voice was thinner now, tinged with panic. Peter raised his hand and knocked twice, gently. The door creaked wider. Owen appeared in the gap. "You came," Owen said, not as a question, just a quiet recognition. Peter nodded. "Can I come in?" There was a pause. Owen glanced behind him, then opened the door fully. The apartment was dim and cold, no heat. The carpet was stained in spots, and the windows fogged with condensation. In the corner, next to a threadbare couch, lay a thin mattress on the floor. Grace was there, barely conscious, her face pale against the faded floral pillowcase. A damp cloth rested on her forehead. Eli knelt beside her, holding her hand. Peter's eyes swept the room. No TV, no table. A single framed photo on the wall showed the 3 of them, smiling in better times. A stack of empty soup cans sat in the corner. "She's burning up," Owen said, his voice rougher now, bracing. "She needs a hospital," Peter said, stepping closer. Eli didn't look up. "We don't have money. That's why we were selling our car." Peter crouched beside the mattress, placing the back of his hand gently on Grace's cheek. Her skin was blazing. She stirred faintly, but didn't open her eyes. "How long has she been like this?" 4 days, Owen said. "She got worse last night." "You should have called someone," Peter said carefully. Eli's eyes lifted, wide and anxious. "We were scared they'd take us away." Peter looked at him, and for a moment he saw Mason's eyes, his son, 5 years old and always full of questions. He swallowed the lump in his throat. "Wait here," Peter said. He stood and stepped into the hallway, pulling out his phone. As he dialed, a woman's voice drifted from behind the next door. "You finally doing something about her?" A tall woman in a faded housecoat leaned in the frame of 3C. She had curlers in her hair and a cigarette in her hand. "She been coughing for weeks. They turned her away from St. Mary's last month. No insurance. You family?" Peter paused. Close enough. He went back in. Owen had wrapped Grace in a blanket. Eli clutched a small backpack, eyes darting between his mother and the man now commanding the room. Peter bent down and gently lifted Grace into his arms. She barely stirred. The twins followed him out the door without needing to be asked. "Where are we going?" Eli asked as they descended the stairs. "To people who can help her," Peter said, already dialing the hospital again. "Will they let us in?" "They will," he said. They passed the old man from downstairs again. He looked up, surprised. "Is she okay?" he asked. "Not yet," Peter said, stepping into the streetlight. His car was parked half a block away, sleek and black, like it didn't belong here. He opened the back door and motioned the boys in. Grace murmured something unintelligible in his arms. Peter settled her carefully across the seat and climbed in beside her. As the car pulled away from Maplewood Heights, Eli whispered, "She doesn't even know we're going." Peter glanced at him. "She will." He looked down at the toy car still in his coat pocket and felt its shape through the fabric. As the streetlight slipped past the windows, he realized something terrifying. He had just made a choice he couldn't unmake. Before we get into the next part, I would love to know what kind of stories you like to read. And please watch the whole story and let me know what you think. If you like my story, please comment 8 p.m. in the comments. The fluorescent lights in the ER waiting area buzzed faintly overhead, casting a pale glow across the dull blue linoleum. Outside, the sky had deepened to full night, and cold rain tapped sporadically against the tall hospital windows. Inside, everything smelled like antiseptic and waiting. Peter Caldwell sat in a stiff plastic chair near the trauma bay, his coat still on, one arm cradling Eli's sleeping form against his side. Owen had long since nodded off on his other shoulder, chin tilted awkwardly, arms crossed tight to his chest. Both boys had fought sleep, but exhaustion had finally won. Across the corridor, behind a curtain and a blur of busy nurses, Grace was being treated. Machines beeped steadily, and her body lay still as her vitals were monitored. Peter hadn't moved in over an hour. A nurse passed by with a clipboard. Peter caught her sleeve. "Who's in charge here?" The nurse startled, then glanced at the sleeping children and softened. "That would be Dr. Patel. She's attending tonight. I want to speak to her." The nurse blinked. "She's with a critical patient." Peter pulled out his wallet and passed her a slim black card. "Tell her Peter Caldwell requests an update. Now." The nurse hesitated only a moment longer before nodding and hurrying off. Peter let out a breath, slow and measured. His hand rested on Eli's shoulder. The boy murmured something unintelligible and burrowed closer. The curtain separating Grace from the corridor pulled aside, and a woman in navy scrubs stepped out. Mid-40s, sharp eyes, calm hands. She approached Peter, glancing briefly at the twins. "You're the one who brought in Grace Whitaker?" she asked. "I am. She's responding to fluids and fever reducers, severe dehydration, a progressing infection. You got her here just in time." Peter looked down, then nodded. "What happens now?" "We'll admit her for at least 3 nights, possibly longer. She'll need IV antibiotics and monitoring." Peter didn't hesitate. "She gets whatever she needs. No delays, no limitations." Dr. Patel gave him a look, the kind doctors reserved for the wealthy who spoke like gods. "You family?" He paused. "Not legally. But you're paying?" "Yes." She nodded once, Understood. As she turned away, Peter stopped her. The boys? Dr. Patel looked at them for a long moment. They can stay overnight in the family area, but they can't stay long-term. Peter glanced down. Eli's hand had slipped into his coat pocket, unconsciously gripping the hem. Owen, still sleeping, leaned heavier into his side. They looked like they'd done this before, held each other up because no one else would. Peter whispered, almost to himself, they shouldn't go back there. Dr. Patel didn't answer. She just moved on. Peter sat there a while longer, watching nurses pass, the rhythm of the hospital pulsing quietly around him. The toy car sat in his pocket, its edges pressing into his leg. He didn't reach for it, but it was there, like a small reminder. Eli stirred again. This time his eyes fluttered open, unfocused and heavy. "Is Mum going to die?" he whispered. Peter looked at him, not with pity, but with something steadier. "No," he said. "She's getting the best care possible now." The boy blinked, then leaned into him again. "Okay." A few minutes later, Peter gently roused Owen. The boy came awake fast, like someone used to being alert when needed. "She's going to be okay," Peter said quietly. "They're keeping her here." Owen nodded slowly and then rubbed his face. "Where do we go now?" Peter hesitated only a second. "You'll come stay with me, just until your mother is better." Owen narrowed his eyes, protective instinct flaring up. "Why would you do that?" Peter met his gaze. "Because she needs time to heal. Because no one should go back to that apartment alone. Because you sold me a car." That last part softened something in Owen. Still, he asked, "Is it a real house?" "It's a big house," Peter replied. "Too big, if I'm being honest." Eli looked up again. "With beds?" "Yes, and food, and heat." Neither boy spoke for a long time. Then Owen gave a slight nod. Peter stood, still stiff, and motioned toward the exit. "Come on, I'll drive you there now. You can come back to visit your mum tomorrow." As they left the ER, Dr. Patel passed them again. "We'll call if there's any change," she said. Peter nodded, then looked down at the boys. "Say goodnight." They walked back to the curtained room. Grace was asleep, her face still pale but less drawn. Owen reached out and touched her hand lightly. "We'll be back, Mum," he said. Eli leaned in, kissed her forehead. "Don't worry." Peter waited silently at the door, his heart ticking with something unfamiliar. When the boys rejoined him, they didn't speak. The drive to Caldwell Estate, Evergreen Hills, was quiet. City lights flickered past the windows as the boys watched the world move by, silent and wide-eyed. Peter drove with one hand on the wheel and the other resting near his coat pocket. The toy car was still there. And somehow, so were they. The first light of morning streamed through tall windows, casting golden rectangles across the oak floors of Caldwell Estate. The vast foyer echoed with the soft steps of curious feet, and the silence of the house was broken only by the muffled whispering of two boys discovering a world they'd never imagined. Outside, the trees of Evergreen Hills stood tall and bare, a reminder that winter was near. "Look at this kitchen," Eli said, pulling open a cabinet taller than he was. "It has a fridge, just for drinks." Owen, standing near a grand staircase, trailed his fingers along the polished banister. "This place feels like a museum." Peter stood a few feet behind them, still in yesterday's clothes, watching with unreadable eyes. The boy's wonder stirred something in him. Pride, maybe, or guilt. "Everything here is real," he said softly. "You're safe." They both turned to him, startled by his voice, but not afraid. Eli smiled. Owen gave a cautious nod. Mrs. Delaney, the housekeeper, appeared at the edge of the hallway. Petite, silver-haired, and sharp as ever, she folded her arms and raised an eyebrow. "Mr. Caldwell doesn't usually have guests." "They're not guests," Peter said before he could stop himself. "They're temporary." Mrs. Delaney approached the boys with a warm, practiced smile. "Well then, if you're staying, even temporarily, we'd better make sure you don't get lost in all these hallways." "Too late," Eli said. "I already did. Twice." A rare flicker of a grin passed across Peter's face. Mrs. Delaney caught it, but said nothing. The boys took off exploring, their small steps pattering against the wooden floor. Peter followed slowly, hands in his pockets, until he saw Owen pause at the end of the west corridor, where a white-painted door stood slightly ajar. Peter's heart tightened. Eli reached for the handle. "What's in—" "That room is private." Peter's voice sliced through the air, sharper than he intended. Both boys froze. Peter walked toward them, his steps measured. "The rest of the house is yours to explore," he said, softer now. "But that door stays closed. Understood?" Owen nodded immediately. Eli looked disappointed, but obeyed. Peter didn't watch them walk away. He just stared at the door, his throat tight. Later that afternoon, Peter drove the boys back to St. Mary's. The car ride was quiet except for Eli, softly counting trees as they passed. Owen stared out the window, hands clasped in his lap. When they entered Grace's room, she was awake. She blinked as they stepped in, her voice hoarse. "You're here? All of you?" "Hi, Mum," Owen said, trying to sound casual. Eli ran forward and hugged her gently. "You look way better." Peter lingered by the door. Grace looked from her sons to the man behind them. "Mr. Caldwell?" Before he could answer, Eli blurted out, "Mr. Caldwell is letting us stay at his house, Mum." Peter winced. Grace's eyes sharpened. "You're what?" "It's just temporary," Peter said quickly, "until you're strong enough to come home. Somewhere warm. Safe." Grace tried to sit up straighter. "I don't understand. Why would you—" "You needed help," Peter said quietly. "And I could help." Her eyes didn't leave his. "People don't just do that. Not for strangers." "You're not strangers anymore," Peter replied, tone even. "Not to them." Eli turned back to his mum. "It's huge. Mrs. Delaney made pancakes. There's a telescope in the library." Grace touched his hair, her fingers thin and trembling. "That sounds very kind." There was an awkward silence. Then Owen asked, "Can we come again tomorrow?" Grace nodded slowly. "Yes, please." Peter stepped outside to give them space. He found himself pacing the hallway, stopping only when Mrs. Patel approached. "She's responding well," the doctor said. "Another day or two, and she can be moved out of ICU." Peter nodded. "That's good." Dr. Patel studied him. "You've been here a lot for someone who isn't family." Peter looked at her. Maybe that definition's changing. Back at the estate, the boys were quieter. Mrs. Delaney met them with soup and warm rolls. After dinner, Owen read quietly on the couch, while Eli lay on the rug, staring at the ceiling, humming softly. Peter stood at the hallway entrance, listening to the sound of life filling a house that had gone too quiet for too long. He glanced toward the locked door. His hand twitched, but he didn't move. Not tonight. The afternoon sun drifted lazily through the high windows of the drawing room, warming the polished floor in slow-moving shapes. Dust floated in golden beams, stirred by faint movement and the hush of a house too grand to ever feel full. Somewhere in the distance, a grandfather clock ticked with a patient rhythm, as if the place was still holding its breath. Owen wasn't supposed to be in the formal sitting room. He knew that. But the map hanging behind the display case had caught his attention. It showed Evergreen Hills 100 years ago, with inked roads and strange names. He'd only meant to look closer. He hadn't meant to bump the pedestal. The sound of porcelain shattering was small, but sharp. Final. Owen stared down at the broken vase, a tall, pale blue piece with gold leaf designs curling up its sides. His breath caught. He crouched quickly, hands trembling, and began picking up the shards, cradling them in his palms, as if gentleness might undo the damage. He heard footsteps. Peter's voice came from behind, low and even. "Are you hurt?" Owen spun around. No, I'm fine. I was just trying to see the map. I didn't touch the vase, it just—" He stopped. The panic in his chest rose hot and thick. Peter walked over, looking at the pieces. "I'm sorry," Owen said. "I didn't mean to. Please don't be mad." Peter crouched beside him, picking up a fragment of the vase. He turned it over slowly, then set it down. "It's just a thing," he said. "Things can be replaced." Owen blinked. "You're not mad?" Peter met his eyes. "No." Mrs. Delaney appeared in the doorway, a tea towel over her shoulder. She looked from the scene to Peter, then back to Owen. "Everything all right in here?" "Just an accident," Peter said. "Could you grab the dustpan?" Mrs. Delaney studied them both, then gave a short nod. "Of course." She returned a moment later, and while she swept, Owen lingered by the doorway, guilt still heavy in his chest. As she worked, Mrs. Delaney murmured without looking up, "We all break things sometimes, dear." Owen's brow furrowed. "But this wasn't mine to break." She straightened and handed him a damp cloth. "Neither was your mother's illness, yet you're still trying to fix it." He didn't know what to say, so he just nodded and helped her clean up the last of the dust. Dinner that night was quieter than usual. Eli barely touched his food. Peter noticed but didn't press. Afterward, Owen stayed back to help Mrs. Delaney dry the dishes, while Peter went to his office. He tried answering emails, but the words blurred on the screen. He could still see Owen's small hands sweeping porcelain pieces into a pile. Still hear Eli's fork scraping untouched against his plate. When the house finally settled into its evening hush, Peter stepped into the hallway. The grandfather clock struck 10. He passed the boy's bedroom and paused. A sound reached him. Software, choked, crying. He hesitated, then gently pushed the door open. Eli sat upright in bed, knees pulled to his chest, tears wetting his cheeks. The moonlight through the window caught the shine of them. Peter entered slowly. "What's wrong?" Eli wiped his nose on his sleeve. "I miss Mom." Peter sat on the edge of the bed, the mattress creaking under his weight. "She's getting better," he said. "Dr. Patel said she might move out of ICU soon." Eli's voice wobbled. "What if she doesn't come back?" Peter didn't answer right away. He looked at the small boy in front of him, his narrow shoulders, his hopeful fear. Peter had heard that question once before, from a different mouth, a different room, a lifetime ago. He spoke carefully. "She will. The doctors are very good." Eli didn't look convinced. "Our dad died when we were 5, he whispered. "Mum said sometimes people just don't come back." Peter's chest tightened. The same guilt that had lived there for 5 years stirred like a phantom. Without thinking, he reached out and rested a hand lightly on Eli's back. "Your mum is coming back. I promise." Eli leaned into the touch, silent now, but his breathing still uneven. Across the room, Owen stirred in his sleep and turned over. Peter stayed until Eli's breath finally evened out and his body went slack with sleep. He stood slowly, moving to the door. Just before stepping out, he looked back. The room wasn't unfamiliar anymore. It felt lived in. Down the hall, Peter walked past the locked door again. His hand brushed the handle, but didn't stop. Not tonight, but closer. The sun hung low over evergreen hills, casting a warm amber hue across the Caldwell estate's stone exterior. Inside, light spilled through tall windows into the main foyer, where wood floors gleamed beneath polished shoes and socked feet alike. Outside, the garden swayed gently in the breeze. But within, the stillness was being rewritten. Slowly, room by room. Peter stood near the entryway, adjusting the cuff of his sleeve, though he wasn't going anywhere. He looked up as the front door creaked open. Grace stepped in slowly, her hospital bag in one hand, her frame still a bit unsteady. The twins were already ahead of her, rushing through the foyer. "Mum, come see the piano room," Owen called over his shoulder. "No, first the telescope," Eli argued, grabbing her free hand. Grace laughed softly. It was the first sound Peter heard that didn't feel borrowed from some place too far from home. She turned toward him. "Thank you for bringing me here." "You needed somewhere safe," Peter said simply. This seemed to qualify. She raised an eyebrow. "This place qualifies as a lot of things." Before Peter could answer, Owen shouted from down the hall. "The fridge has a drawer just for soda. Mrs. Delaney calls it the bachelor drawer." Peter blinked. "She what?" "Her words, not mine," Grace said, smiling. They followed the boys into the kitchen, where Mrs. Delaney had already set the table. A roast chicken steamed in the center, flanked by mashed potatoes, sautéed green beans, and cornbread still warm from the oven. Peter hesitated in the doorway. Grace brushed past him, pulled by the smell, the comfort of something familiar. She touched the back of a chair, then sat slowly, as though afraid the whole thing might vanish if she moved too quickly. Owen and Eli were already bickering over who got the drumstick. Mrs. Delaney intervened with practiced grace, dividing the portions like she'd done this 100 times before. Peter took the seat across from Grace. For a long moment, no one said anything. Then Eli, mouth full of cornbread, looked up. "Did you tell Mum you taught us chess?" Grace turned to Peter, amused. "You've been teaching them chess?" "They asked," Peter said, clearing his throat. "I obliged. They say you're good." Peter met her gaze. "I used to play a lot." Grace's eyes lingered on him a moment longer, but she didn't press. "Mr. Caldwell made a rule," Owen added. "We can only use the telescope if we name 3 constellations." Grace looked surprised. "Is that right?" Peter gave a sheepish nod. "Educational incentives, or bribery, depending on your perspective." Dinner moved in small, unhurried moments. Grace asked about the boys' days, the rooms they liked, the pancakes Mrs. Delaney made. Peter watched more than he spoke, his fork idly tracing circles in the potatoes, though he answered when spoken to. After the dishes were cleared and the leftovers tucked away, Owen pulled out the chessboard from the side cabinet. "Can we?" he asked. Peter looked at Grace. She shrugged. "They've been waiting all week." The 4 of them gathered near the fireplace. Peter set the board between them, and Eli climbed onto the arm of the sofa beside him. Grace sat cross-legged on the floor, pulling her sweater tighter around her. "You start," Peter told Owen. The boy moved a pawn. Peter countered with a knight. "You taught them about forks yet?" Grace asked. Peter looked surprised. "You play?" "My dad did. He thought girls needed to know how to beat boys at strategy." Peter smirked. "Smart man." They played 3 rounds. Eli declared himself the commentator for the last one, narrating each move with unnecessary drama. Owen took the game more seriously, brow furrowed, while Grace offered mock villain advice from the sideline. Peter let himself lose the last match. No one noticed, except maybe Grace. Afterward, the boys disappeared upstairs to brush their teeth, their laughter echoing down the hallway. Peter remained by the unlit fire, watching the queen piece roll in his fingers. Grace didn't leave either. "They're different here," she said after a pause. Peter looked up. "Lighter? Like They've been carrying less weight. He nodded. Maybe they are. She studied him for a moment, then asked, "What made you say yes that day? In the park?" Peter considered. "I'm not sure." That's not an answer. He glanced at the empty hallway. Sometimes people come into your life and remind you of what you forgot you had the capacity for. Grace didn't respond right away. Then she said, "It's a good thing you remembered." The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was warm, the kind you can sit inside without needing to fill. Upstairs, the twins bickered over who got the big pillow. Grace stood. "I should check on them." Peter nodded, but didn't rise. She paused near the door. "Peter?" He looked up. "This doesn't have to be temporary." Then she disappeared down the hall, leaving him with the queen piece still in his hand and a strange, unfamiliar feeling blooming quietly in his chest. A soft drizzle tapped against the tall windows of the library, leaving streaks that blurred the winter-grey view outside. Inside, the room smelled faintly of leather and cedar, a comfortable mix of old books and quiet wealth. The fireplace had been lit earlier, but now smouldered low, casting a gentle amber flicker across the worn rug. Peter sat at his desk with a mug of untouched coffee cooling beside him. The day had dragged into itself, emails unanswered, calls deferred. His focus had splintered, drifting too often to the hallway beyond the library, where the sound of children's footsteps had gradually become something he noticed rather than resented. A light knock pulled his attention. Eli peeked his head around the doorway. "You busy?" Peter shook his head. "Number, come in." The boy stepped inside, careful, almost formal. He clutched something small in one hand, a Lego astronaut missing one arm. He moved toward the bookshelf, but didn't look at the books. "Do you always keep it there?" Eli asked, glancing at the blazer hung neatly over the back of the armchair. Peter followed his gaze, brow furrowing. "Keep what?" Eli pointed gently. "The toy car. I saw you take it out once." Peter said nothing at first. He reached over and retrieved the blazer. From the inside pocket, he drew out the small red toy car, the same one the boys had handed him in the park, days ago, that now felt like months. He turned it over in his palm. "I'm not sure why I keep it there," Peter said. "Maybe because I haven't known what to do with it." Eli sat on the edge of the rug, legs crossed. He placed the armless astronaut in front of him, lining it up beside the queen chess piece Peter had left out from the night before. "It was our dad's," Eli said. "He gave it to us right before he died." Peter glanced at him, surprised by the calmness in his voice. "I don't remember him much," Eli continued, "but Owen says I used to call him Captain Dad because he had a Mustang and liked pretending it could talk." Peter smiled softly. "Sounds like a good dad." Eli nodded, fiddling with the astronaut. "We fought over that car a lot, but when Mom got sick, we both agreed to keep it safe." Peter looked down at the toy again. It was faded, a little scuffed, but well kept. He could still see the smudge of fingerprints along the windows, the chipped spot on the bumper where love had outlasted plastic. "I didn't know it meant that much to you," Peter said quietly. Eli shrugged. "We needed medicine more." There was no guilt in his tone, only a child's stark clarity. Then, after a pause, Eli tilted his head. "Did you have kids?" Peter set the car down on the desk. For a second, he thought about deflecting, changing the subject, but something in Eli's eyes, patient, open, left no room for hiding. "A son," he said. "His name was Mason." Eli said nothing, just waited. "He and my wife, Lauren, died in a car crash 5 years ago." The words came out more gently than Peter had expected, like they had softened in his chest from years of being kept in. "I'm sorry," Eli said. Peter nodded. looking at the small car again. Mason was 5. Just like you. Eli leaned forward slightly. What was he like? Peter's throat tightened. He loved space, built entire worlds out of cardboard, hated broccoli, thought dogs should be allowed to vote. Eli laughed. Just once, but it cracked something open in the quiet. Did he have toys like this one? Eli asked. Peter hesitated. He had a box of cars. A few were red like this. His favorite had rocket boosters drawn on the sides. I bet he would have liked ours, Eli said, reaching out to run a finger along the toy's roof. Mrs. Delaney passed by the open door just then. She paused, saw them, Peter on the edge of his desk, Eli cross-legged on the rug. She didn't speak, just offered a small, knowing smile and continued down the hall. The fire popped. Peter looked at Eli again. You know, you can take this back if you want. Eli shook his head. We sold it fairly. But it was your dad's. Mum says a deal is a deal. He paused, then added more softly, and maybe you need it now more than we do. Peter didn't speak. His fingers curled gently around the car again, holding it not like an object, but a memory made real. Eli stood and dusted off his knees. Maybe we came into your life to help you too. Peter blinked. What? That's what Mum says, Eli said. People don't always show up when you expect them, but sometimes they show up when you need them. The boy smiled, then turned and padded quietly out of the library, astronaut in hand. Peter sat back in his chair, the toy car resting in the middle of his desk. Outside, the drizzle had turned to steady rain, streaking the glass and blurring the hills beyond. He didn't reach for his phone, didn't open his laptop. Instead, he let the silence hold him, and, for once, let it heal. The night pressed quietly against the windows of Caldwell Estate, silver moonlight trailing across the carpeted hallway like a slow exhale. The rest of the house had long since settled into sleep, save for the occasional creak of wood shifting with the cool. A lamp glowed faintly in Peter's hand, his steps soundless on the floor outside the west corridor. He stood before the white door, the one he hadn't opened in 5 years. The key turned more easily than he expected. A soft click, then silence. He pushed the door open. Dust floated in the air like tiny stars. The room was untouched, still blue-walled with solar system decals, still lined with toy shelves and a race car bed with rumpled spaceship sheets. It smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old memories. The light landed on a row of books Peter hadn't read in years, and a framed photo still perched on the nightstand. Mason, Lauren, and Peter on a beach, laughing, sun in their hair. Peter stepped inside. He didn't turn on the overhead light. The dim glow from the lamp in his hand was enough to bring it all back. Every color, every object, every ghost. Behind him, the door creaked again. He turned, startled. Eli stood in the hallway, barefoot, pajama-clad, eyes wide. I saw the door open, he said softly. I thought maybe you were in trouble. Peter hesitated, then nodded slowly. I'm not. Not tonight. The boy took a step forward. This was your son's room, wasn't it? Yes, Peter's voice rasped. His name was Mason. Eli stepped inside carefully, as though the room might break beneath his weight. His gaze moved over the model rockets on the desk, the stack of illustrated astronomy books, the toy cars lined up on the shelf. He liked space, Eli said, remembering. Peter gave a faint smile. He thought Pluto was unfairly demoted. Eli stopped beside the bed, his fingers brushing the edge of the wrinkled comforter. Did he know he was loved? Peter swallowed. I hope so. For a while, neither spoke. Eli glanced at the nightstand. Is that your wife? Peter nodded. She looks like she laughed a lot. She did. So did Mason. His voice cracked, almost imperceptibly. He'd make up songs about cereal, insisted socks never matched. Eli sat cross-legged on the carpet. He sounds awesome. He was. Peter lowered himself to the floor beside the boy, the room still thick with quiet. I miss him, Peter said finally, the words soft and heavy. Every day. Eli looked down at his hands, fidgeting. We miss our dad too. Peter turned slightly. What was he like? Eli thought for a long time. I don't remember much. Just his laugh. And once he held me on his shoulders so I could touch a stop sign. Peter smiled gently. That's a good memory. Eli's gaze drifted to the toy shelf. You know, one of those cars looks just like the one we sold you. Peter followed his line of sight. A silver race car with a cracked spoiler, dusty but still gleaming. That was Mason's favorite, he said. He used to pretend it had wings. Eli got up, walked over, and picked it up with both hands. He stared at it for a moment before carrying it back and placing it beside the red car Peter had retrieved from his pocket earlier. They can be friends, Eli said matter-of-factly. Red and silver. Peter watched the two cars sitting side by side. Yeah, maybe they can. There was a soft knock on the door. Grace stood in the doorway, her expression unreadable at first, then softer, almost fragile. I saw the light, she said. I didn't know you had come in here. Peter stood slowly. First time in a long while. She stepped inside cautiously, her eyes scanning the room. It's beautiful, she whispered. He must have been a wonderful little boy. Peter looked at her. He was. Her gaze fell on the photo. She picked it up gently, thumb tracing the edge of the frame. I'm sorry they're gone, she said, without pity, just truth. Peter's shoulders tensed. Then he let them go. I was driving, he admitted. A truck ran a red light. I survived. They didn't. The silence that followed wasn't heavy. It was honest. Grace moved beside him, placing the photo down. You've been punishing yourself, she said gently. Peter looked at her, the weight behind his eyes unguarded for the first time. How do you stop? She rested a hand on his. Maybe, she said. You already have. Eli smiled from the carpet. Mum says people come into our lives for a reason. Peter met her eyes. For the first time in years, he said quietly. I think she might be right. They all stood there a moment longer, 3 people in a room meant for a 4th, until Grace whispered, he'd be proud of you, you know. Of this? Of opening the door? Peter blinked, but didn't look away. I hope so, he said. Outside, the wind stirred the trees. Inside, for the first time in 5 winters, Mason's room felt warm again. Morning sunlight pooled through the tall kitchen windows, casting long gold stripes across the tiled floor. Outside, birds darted between branches just beginning to bud, the first timid sign that winter's grip was weakening. Inside, the Caldwell estate was no longer a museum of quiet. It was moving, humming, awake. Peter stood by the kitchen island, sleeves rolled up, a whisk in hand, and a bemused look on his face. You're holding that like a golf club, Grace said, gently elbowing him aside as she took over. Probably explains the pancakes, he replied, eyeing the lumpy batter in the bowl. Eli and Owen sat on the counter stools, swinging their legs and offering unsolicited critiques. Try less flour, Eli said, squinting at the batter like a judge on a baking show. Or more eggs, Owen countered. That's what Mrs. Delaney does. Peter arched an eyebrow. I thought this was my breakfast. Grace grinned without looking at him. It was, until the children unionized. He leaned back, watching her move easily through the kitchen. She had a dish towel tucked into the waistband of her jeans and a slight blush in her cheeks from the warmth of the stove. It was a vision Peter didn't realize he'd missed. Someone inhabiting his kitchen with ease. Not with careful, hired professionalism, but casual comfort, like it belonged to more than just him. Later, after breakfast, and after the boys had disappeared upstairs to build a cardboard research station in the hallway, Peter reached into the cabinet for plates to help Grace clear. Their hands touched. Not a brush. A pause. Neither of them pulled away. Grace looked at him, quiet, sure, and Peter felt the weight of that small moment settle between them. Not heavy, just present. "I got good news at my appointment," she said, voice soft but steady. Peter tilted his head. "Yeah? My kidney function is improving. The doctor says I might reduce treatment to once a week." Peter's mouth parted slightly. Then, "That's incredible." She nodded, setting the last plate in the sink. "It feels like a breath I haven't been able to take in months." "You've earned it." Grace wiped her hands on the towel. "I didn't do it alone." They stood there for a beat longer, the sounds of distant laughter echoing faintly from upstairs. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. Peter frowned. "Regret what?" "Letting us in." He shook his head once. "No." Her smile was small, but real. Just then, Mrs. Delaney swept into the kitchen with a pile of freshly folded towels. "Children have claimed the second guest room as a spaceship command center," she reported dryly. "I'm not allowed in unless I knock and say the code phrase." Peter raised a brow. "Which is?" "Apparently, Captain Crunch approves." He chuckled, then turned to Grace. "You ever think a house like this could sound like that?" She looked toward the hallway, where the sound of cardboard rustling and giggles carried faintly. "I think this is what a house is supposed to sound like." Later that afternoon, Grace and the boys wandered out into the garden, while Peter remained inside. He found himself in the study, pouring coffee into 2 mugs out of habit. When he realized she wasn't back yet, he walked them both out onto the terrace. Grace sat under the pergola, watching Owen chase Eli with a foam sword. Peter handed her the second cup. She took it, her fingers grazing his again. "This place," she said, not turning toward him. "It used to feel like a castle." Peter sat beside her. "Cold and echoey?" She nodded. "And unreachable. What does it feel like now?" She looked at him, like someone opened a window. They watched the boys for a while. Owen tripped, fell, and Eli immediately stopped to check on him. A moment later, both were laughing again. "I had this idea," Peter said after a long silence, "that grief should stay locked away, that letting it out made it more dangerous somehow. And now, I think letting it out might be the only thing that makes space for anything else." Grace reached out, resting her hand over his on the bench between them. "You don't have to say everything, Peter. You're already showing it." He didn't look at her, but his hand turned slightly under hers, fingers brushing against her palm. He didn't pull away. The moment stretched quietly. Not fragile, but new. That evening, after the boys were tucked in and the house had settled, Peter returned to the kitchen. He poured 2 glasses of wine, unsure if she'd join him, but hopeful. She did. They stood by the counter, no longer strangers in his house, no longer walking on cautious edges. Grace took a sip and said, almost teasing, "So, are you going to let me help fix that bookshelf Mason cracked or not?" Peter smirked. "You noticed?" "I notice more than you think." He met her gaze, slower this time. "Yeah, I'm starting to see that." Upstairs, in the quiet hallway, the door to Mason's room stood slightly open. Not wide, but not closed anymore. A pair of toy cars, one red, one silver, sat side by side on the windowsill. And from the garden below, laughter rose again. The house had once been silent. Now, it was alive. The evening sky over evergreen hills glowed in deep hues of rose and violet, the kind of sunset that lingered a moment longer than expected, like it had something left to say. The garden below swayed in the last golden breeze of the day, petals nodding as shadows lengthened across the stone terrace. Inside the Caldwell estate, the house hummed, not with sound, but with presence. Grace sat on the edge of the piano bench, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the wood grain. The lid was closed. She hadn't played. She didn't know how. Peter stood across the room, arms loosely crossed, leaning against the frame of the wide, arched window. He wasn't watching the sky. He was watching her. "You've been quiet today," he said gently. She glanced up, then back down. "I've been thinking." That's never a good sign. That earned him a small smile. "I got another call from the clinic. They want me to come in next week to talk about ongoing treatment options. There's a chance I could manage things from home with less frequency." Peter nodded slowly. "That's good news." "It is." She hesitated. "Which means we probably need to talk about what happens next." He didn't move. "You mean when you leave?" Grace exhaled. "Yes." Peter pushed off the window frame and crossed to the kitchen table. He picked up a folded envelope, something he'd left there intentionally. "I've been meaning to give you this," he said, handing it to her. She opened it carefully. Inside was a typed offer. Part-time administrative work at a nearby medical office, flexible hours, full benefits, her name already filled in. "You pulled strings," she said. "I asked a favor." "Why?" Peter sat across from her. "Because I knew the question was coming, and because I want you to have choices." She looked down at the paper. "This would mean staying here." He didn't answer immediately. "Grace," he said, voice low, steady, "I don't want this to be temporary anymore." Her eyes rose to meet his. "You mean the job?" He smiled faintly. "I mean all of it. You, the boys, here." Silence stretched between them. Not uncomfortable, but charged. "Stay," Peter said, "not as temporary guests, but permanently." Grace's breath caught. She folded the paper carefully and placed it on the bench beside her. "Peter," she started, shaking her head. "I know," he said. "You think it's too soon, too complicated." She stood, pacing a few steps. "People will talk. They'll say I manipulated you, that I used my situation. Let them talk." His voice was calm, but sure. "I've lived for others' expectations long enough." She turned toward him, arms crossed over her chest. "You don't owe me anything. I know that. You've already given us so much. A place to stay, help, support. You've rebuilt part of your life because of us." Peter stepped forward. I started living again because of you." Her jaw clenched, emotions fighting just under the surface. "I'm afraid." He nodded. "Me too." Grace blinked. "You?" "I've built walls so high for so long I forgot what it felt like to let anyone in. And now that I have, I'm terrified of losing it." She swallowed. "It? This?" he said, gesturing between them. "You, the boys, the noise in the halls, the coffee mugs left half full in the sink, the chess pieces under the couch, all of it." Grace let her arms drop slowly. "What are you really asking, Peter?" "I'm asking you to stay, not out of gratitude, not because I saved you, but because I think we might save each other." She stared at him, unsure of how to hold everything he was offering. Then Owen's voice floated down the stairs. "Mom, we can't find the astronaut." Grace smiled, tears shining in her eyes. "I'll be right up." Peter stepped aside as she passed. She paused beside him. "I'm not ready to promise forever," she said, "but maybe I'm ready to stop running." He reached for her hand, gently curling his fingers around hers. "Then that's more than enough." She gave his hand a soft squeeze, then let go and walked toward the stairs. Peter remained in the quiet room, the hum of the house echoing like a slow heartbeat. At the window, the last light of dusk faded over the hills, and in his chest, something fragile but real began to settle into place. The early morning sunlight spilled across the tiled kitchen floor in honeyed streaks, warming the quiet corners of the Caldwell estate with a gentle touch. Outside, birds trilled softly in the hedges, their calls rising above the hush of a world just waking. Inside, the house breathed, not in the hollow silence of a museum, but with the rhythm of lived-in peace. Peter stood at the stove, spatula in hand, brow furrowed in concentration as he flipped a pancake that didn't quite obey the laws of physics. Beside him, Grace leaned against the counter, sipping coffee from a chipped ceramic mug, the one with a faint chip she always chose on purpose. "You're flipping too early," she said, stifling a smile. Peter glanced sideways. "If there's a pancake union, I fully expect to be reported." "You'll be tried by syrup," she said, nudging his elbow gently. From upstairs came the sound of galloping feet, and then Owen's voice, bright and clear. "Mr. Caldwell, pancakes are ready." Peter paused, spatula still raised. Grace turned toward him, amusement twinkling in her eyes. "Still Mr. Caldwell, huh?" He grinned faintly. "I suppose I've earned that title through sheer pancake perseverance. Or maybe because they still think you're secretly a CEO by day, superhero by night." He reached for a plate. "Do superheroes do dishes?" "If they're smart, they do." They moved easily around each other in the kitchen, passing bowls, bumping shoulders, finishing each other's half-formed thoughts. It was a dance they hadn't choreographed, but had somehow learned anyway. When they finally set the platter of golden pancakes on the table, Owen and Eli came tumbling into the room, hair mussed, socks mismatched, already mid-debate. "I get the first pancake because I said please yesterday," Owen declared. "That wasn't today," Eli argued. Mrs. Delaney appeared in the doorway with a basket of folded laundry and a smirk she didn't bother hiding. "What's the point of negotiating with miniature pirates?" "They're practicing for law school," Grace said dryly. Mrs. Delaney placed the basket down. Then she handed Grace a soft cloth. Embroidered into the corner was a single letter, G. Caldwell. Grace's fingers paused. "This isn't mine." "Maybe not yet," Mrs. Delaney said, voice softer. "But I have a feeling it will be." Grace swallowed and tucked the cloth into her pocket. The boys were now seated and tearing into their pancakes with such enthusiasm that syrup had already made its way into Eli's hair. Peter raised an eyebrow. "You planning to shower in maple?" "Efficient," Eli mumbled around a bite. As they ate, Owen looked up and said, "Remember when breakfast was just toast and stress?" Eli laughed. "Now it's pancakes and yelling." "Progress," Grace said, reaching for more coffee. Peter poured her another cup, their hands brushing again, this time without hesitation. They didn't look at each other. They didn't need to. Just then, Grace's phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen and smiled. "Dr. Patel," she said, stepping into the hallway for a moment. When she returned, her eyes were bright. "Blood work's great," she said. "They said whatever we're doing, it's working." Peter nodded once, quiet pride in his expression. "Then let's keep doing it." They cleared the table slowly. Owen and Eli stacked plates while Peter rinsed. Grace hummed under her breath as she folded napkins into squares and placed them into the drawer like puzzle pieces, finding their place. At the table, Owen stared at the empty chair beside him, the one that had always stayed unfilled. "Can we put Mason's car here today?" he asked. "So he has a spot too?" Peter looked at him, then at the small red toy car resting on the windowsill. He crossed the room, picked it up, and set it gently on the table, just beside a clean plate. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Eli said, "He'd like pancakes too." Grace smiled. "Then he'll always have them here." The moment passed like a breath. Then, as Peter turned to refill the coffee, Owen called again. This time, louder. "Dad, the pancakes are getting cold." Silence. Peter froze. Grace looked up, eyes wide. Owen blinked. "I mean, if that's okay." Peter set the coffee pot down and walked to the table, the quietest of smiles spreading across his face. He ruffled Owen's hair. "That's okay," he said softly. "Yeah, that's more than okay." Grace stood in the doorway, watching the three of them. Two boys and a man, once convinced he was broken beyond repair. The kitchen filled again with laughter, forks clinking, syrup dripping. Not chaos, not noise. Life. The house, once a mausoleum of memories, now sang with them. And in the heart of it, Peter Caldwell sat down at the table, not as a host, or a savior, or a man haunted by the past, but as something much simpler. A father, a partner. A man finally came home. What did you think of this story's journey? From strangers in a park to a family built on healing and quiet courage. Which moments resonated with you the most? For me, it's a reminder that sometimes the people we least expect walk into our lives to mend what we thought was beyond repair, and that love doesn't always arrive loudly, but it stays quietly, deeply.